My name is Michael Bryce. For those of you who were here yesterday, welcome again. Those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. Our first session this morning is Regulatory Issues of Importance to Consumers. The moderator for this session is the Executive Director of the Fair Trading Commission, David Miller. I now turn you over to Mr. Miller, who will introduce the other members of his panel.
Thank you very much. And it is this kind of forum is very instructive in how we move forward. A lot of information is aired here, as we heard yesterday, and it is important, as we all know, that we use this information in a positive way to build our thinking and our thought process as we move forward. Before I introduce the panel, I would like to make a few remarks. Yesterday we heard much about the positive value that the OUR has brought to our economy as a whole in different aspects of life. And I will deliberately make what some would consider provocative statements, or statements that are somewhat mischievous, because consumers are our focus of discussion this morning, and there are several regulatory issues that are of importance to consumers. And as we know, as consumers ourselves, we oftentimes have our own grouses against the regulators, whether it be the OUR or the FSC or things that affect our daily lives. And I will give you two examples from a consumer's perspective. The first one has to do with insurance. Recently, at the end of August, I had to renew my motor vehicle insurance, and the insurance broker sent me by mail a notice that my insurance needs to be renewed. And I got a letter, and I went into the office, and I was told that for their records, I need to produce proof of address. And I said to her, you mailed me this letter, and I've gotten it. Isn't this sufficient proof? She says, well, the regulator requires it. She don't know why, but the FSC says I need proof of address, and it has to be a utility bill. Of course, I'm not too sure why, but there ought to be some good reason as to why this is so. And the other part of that discussion was, they said to me, I need to get my car valued again. I said, I did it last year. I said, every year it needs to be done. So I have to go out and spend another $1,500 to get my car valued again at one of these 5 places, all of which are out of my direction, so I'm incurring an additional cost again, in addition to the increased premium. So who is there to protect my interests as a consumer? Who is there to say these prices are high? And the other example is from the Fair Trading Commission. We get numerous complaints, and one of them, customers of the JPS will call or write in and say, I was at home last night and there was a flickering of the lights and my fridge doesn't work. I have a fridge guard on it and there goes my fridge. What do I do? And we say, well, JPS has a policy that deals with things like that. You have to go through the process, and the OUR is there to assist you. And they say, I've been to the OUR. I'm not getting any positive response. I have no fridge. Who is there to protect my interests? I didn't cause the light to flicker and the fridge to go. I did what I needed to do to protect my fridge. Now I have none and I have to go buy a new fridge. What's up? So who is there to protect my rights and my pocket? And I move to a statement that someone once said, a consumer is a shopper who is sore about something, end quote. For in pursuit of his happiness, a consumer will acquire goods and services according to his willingness and ability to pay for these goods. The goods that will make one consumer happy will not necessarily make another consumer happy, as consumer preferences vary from individual to individual and from time to time and from circumstance to circumstance. Let us think back to the 1990s, which saw the liberalization of most sectors, the privatization of state-owned enterprises, the lifting of import quotas, the removal and reduction of several trade barriers. And this brought technological advancement that impacted upon and further added to the propelling of economic activities. There were new ideas, new services, and new ways of doing business. It was a change of climate of business opportunity for entrepreneurs and of windfall for consumers. The level of consumer choice was unprecedented. And there was this transformation. We all saw what was going on. Our government did, stakeholders of various types from different origins and with different intentions did. And we, the consumers, saw this transformation. But remember that old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So we set out to level the playing field, to set the stage for fair play, for competitive prices, for better choices to consumers, and for there to be increased consumer satisfaction and welfare. Because to ensure that consumers get the maximum benefits, it is necessary for there to be unbridled competition among providers. And where competition is infeasible or unworkable, regulatory intervention becomes necessary. So here came the need for competition laws, the need for consumer protection laws, and a utilities regulator. And it goes without saying that effective competition and by extension increased consumer welfare must work hand in hand with smart regulation. One cannot operate independently of the other. So there was a need for regulation in some form or other in several sectors. Regulation and oversight was strengthened in sectors where it already existed, for example, in banking and finance. And there was the creation of the OUR to maintain oversight in electricity and water, transportation. Telecoms in and of itself was a challenging one, which came with several technological advancements in a relatively short space of time. So Jamaica's experience was not all red wine and roses as far as consumers and market participants are concerned. Because when we bring in regulation, it comes with its own set of laws, rules, guidelines, policies, and practices, some of which may infringe directly or indirectly on consumer rights or consumer interests. Or they may be in conflict with other pieces of legislation that existed before, all of which at the time of passing were well-intentioned. We have from the government side the OUR, the Fair Trading Commission, the Consumer Affairs Commission, to name a few. We have investors whose objective is to maximize profit at all times. And we have consumers who have their own set of needs. The regulator is supposed to bridge a gap between investors and consumers in the interest of maintaining a market that functions well for all. And let's be frank, consumers will say things like, oh, the OUR works for the JPS. Times are so hard, how could they increase the price on my light bill so much at this time? I don't know. But how do we solve this problem of what the regulator was set up to do, of what investors' needs are, of what consumers want, of how to make the correct regulatory decisions, of what is reasonable for all of us to achieve? There ought to be some kind of a balance. And with us here this morning to air the issues on the panel here are Mr. Pash Fuller, Director of the Western Region of the Consumer Affairs Commission, Mrs. Yasmin Chung, the Chair of the Consumer Advisory Committee on Utilities, Mr. David Geddes, Vice President of the National Water Commission, himself used to be an employee of the OUR, and Professor Rosalie Hamilton, who is President of the Micro, Small, and Medium Enterprise Alliance. We would invite you to share your thoughts, but before this, we'll ask each of our panelists to make a short comment on the topic here this morning, regulatory issues of importance to consumers. Mr. Fuller.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Moderator, other members of the panel, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. First of all, let me apologize for my CEO, Mrs. Dulcie Allen, who was supposed to be the person in this particular hot seat, but she's not well. which has asked me to speak to you on behalf of the consumers. There's a PowerPoint presentation, but having been told that I should make it brief, I won't go through all that's there, but I'll just try and, best I can, to look at the more salient points in respect of the topic we're looking at. Regulations. Basically, they're defined as rules to control and manage and conduct those activities, organized activities. And there are agencies that are usually set up to manage these. We can look at a few. You have both ministry and you have agencies under some of those ministries. It is not comprehensive by any means. You have other agencies, for example, like the FSC, which looks at our financial area. And I see a gentleman who has something that's dear to his heart in terms of how the media landscape is dealt with. So that's also another agency that seeks to protect us in more ways than one. What we have found, though, is that there is a gap between what the agency is required to do and what people's perception of what those agencies are. And yes, although it's very good that we have these regulations and these regulatory agencies in place, the consumer needs to have a feel of what it is that these agencies do and how the law itself can, or what, another way, how he can use those regulations to give himself the protection that he so often needs. There are a lot of people who expect that if there's an agency that's involved in regulation, the first thing is that they can lock down the entities that they regulate. And if you're not doing that, what are you doing? You know, what use are you if you can't do things like that? And so the education of the consumer is paramount. We are in the business of that. That's maybe 80% of what we do at the Consumer Affairs Commission, where I represent. And that's one aspect that I would, and all my colleagues at the Consumer Affairs Commission would love to see a greater emphasis placed on by these regulatory agencies. I'll stop there for the time being. We'd certainly develop things as we go along. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It certainly is a pleasure for me to be on this panel this morning. I'm among friends, and more particularly with my fellow alumni from the absolutely best high school in Jamaica, and I don't think I have to tell you the name. You'll all know. No. I want to contribute to this discussion by providing an historical context or perspective, consumers and this whole business of regulation, and then try to answer or to comment on, is it perception or is it reality, and then just make a few other comments. The utilities regulatory process is still a relatively new concept for Jamaican consumers, having been established to balance the interests of all stakeholders and to foster an environment which promotes competition, efficiency, and profitability. Prior to privatization, public utilities were characterized by direct government intervention on pricing, management, and investment, and most importantly, by less than transparent regulatory systems. Increased macroeconomic imbalances resulted in the public sector's provision of utilities becoming grossly inefficient and excluding several segments of the population in spite of government's commitment to universal access for all. Privatization, therefore, represented an important change in the provision of infrastructure and associated services. Governments like that of our own Jamaica were forced to raise the levels of efficiency of service delivery and therefore sought private involvement, in sectors formerly dominated by state ownership. While the privatization route attracted the required and necessary financing for infrastructural development, ownership alone did not and has not solved all the problems associated with public utilities. It was thought that competition needed to be strengthened given the history of monopoly utilities in Jamaica. The most effective solution at the time was the establishment of a regulatory mechanism to monitor and control monopolies, ensure affordability to the most vulnerable in the society, and most importantly, to ensure that the benefits from liberalization redound to all consumers. So if we agree that regulation is an enforceable mechanism designed to circumvent the monopoly power of utility operators and maximize the consumer's welfare, then regulation, therefore, has to be a public good, engaging the tools of rules, meaning, and outcome, which should enjoy public acceptance and apply to all consumers. Regulation has to be non-excludable, and if it is to be fair and transparent, then it must avoid regulatory capture. It is a well-known fact that globally, both the government and the utility operators have enough bargaining power to manipulate the regulatory process in their favor. In supporting the idea of an independent regulator, we must be careful, however, to differentiate between independence and accountability and implement measures including transparency, open decision-making processes, publication of determinations, avoiding conflicts of interest, an effective appeals process, external audits, and scrutiny of the regulator's budget, all of which provide the necessary checks and balances. So based on the context just outlined and having experienced 15 years of regulation, why are consumers in Jamaica not only dissatisfied but extremely suspicious of this business of regulation? Consumers are generally the least organized and least influential stakeholder. So it should come as no surprise if I suggest that the exercise of poor governance is the cause, and the effects are we are not as informed as we should be, due in part to an endemic culture of the public doesn't need to know. And even when it is deemed as fit for airplay, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth is seldom disseminated. This information, public education void, has resulted in a lack of trust and confidence in policy and regulation. Additionally, poor and sporadic approaches to communication have not helped to improve this issue. And consultation means different things to different stakeholders. It is therefore imperative that as part of an independent regulator's decision-making, the consumer must be empowered to sit at that table of decision-making in the regulatory process, as effective regulation will only be achieved through the inputs of all stakeholders. Consumer empowerment requires that consumers are in a position to make the best choice possible for themselves and not regret those choices because they perceive that they have been treated unfairly. An empowered consumer has access to real choices, accurate information, market transparency, and the confidence that comes from effective protection and solid rights. In short, consumers must be empowered to access information, assess that information, and then act on it. Up until the late 1990s, the Jamaican consumer had no real voice in the process, and regulation was therefore prone to mainly political capture. The tariff structures were severely distorted, and average tariffs were set below the long-run average costs. The results were disastrous for the utilities' financial viability, and the resultant problems of underinvestment, congestion, and exclusion emerged. The reasons for these actions were clear. In the private sector, consumers exercise their rights with their dollars, and in the public sector, they vote with their ballots. The conclusions are clear. in the public sector, votes control prices, and the consumer supposedly determines the price in the private sector. The primary role of the consumer in utility regulation is to provide a collective voice on issues related to utilities in order to receive greater attention from regulators, legislators, and utility companies. Although the technical aspects are oftentimes left up to the regulator, consumers must become more inquisitive about all the aspects of the regulatory process, play a more active role in issues of quality of service standards, etc., all of which have a direct impact on improving efficiencies within the operations of the utilities and the regulator. There is general acceptance that consumer groups are critical to the regulatory process. So regulators today face an increasingly difficult challenge. How do you communicate with consumers in a way that encourages trust and engagement in an environment where statements and actions are just routinely dismissed? Some of the ways I would like to suggest in which consumers may become more active participants and not passive recipients in the process include us being a part of the formulation and design of public policy, influence the regulatory cycle in a more real way, encourage and participate in the consultative process, include and facilitate easier public acceptance of the process and the results. The rules and the results must apply to everyone. Decision-making must be fair to all given the wide-ranging inputs. Responsibility in the enforcement process. Monitor the regulator, thereby guaranteeing additional checks and balances in terms of transparency and accountability. Determine what is the common benefit for all as opposed to benefits that accrue to a few. Additionally, consumer groups should effectively participate in developing quality of service standards and provide the regulator with information regarding the utilities' adherence to these standards. It is the responsibility of consumer groups to disseminate the regulatory rights and obligations of all consumers and to then educate and encourage consumers to exercise those rights and properly discharge their obligations. If consumers are to benefit from private-public participation in infrastructure, if our nation's commitments to investors are to be protected, and if the economy as a whole is to benefit from this process, then regulation will have to be competent, fair, and accessible. The inclusion of the consumer guarantees regulatory effectiveness and acceptance, and the roles of consumers, corporations, and even government having changed significantly since the rise of the internet, then consumers are now slowly but surely coming to expect that government and companies can and should listen to their ideas, requests, questions, queries, and that government and companies will react to this input. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. And I'm going to try and do this without my glasses. And hope that works. If not, I have it close by. Ladies and gentlemen, I greet you all well and trust that you've been having a most interesting time here at this very timely and informative forum. Now, having spent 10 years in the field of regulation and having held 4 different positions at the Office of Utilities Regulation, I must say it is with mixed feelings that I speak to the topic, regulatory issues of importance to consumers. I also wonder what would not be of importance to consumers. I would wish to imagine that every aspect of regulation must be of concern to consumers. First off, let me place on the table that it is my considered opinion that with very few exceptions, utility regulators the world over, not just in Jamaica, tend to be arrogant. This arrogance is almost endemic, and it is fueled by the notion that we know what is best for you. I'm not trying to insult regulators, nor am I biting the hand that has fed me in the past and is probably likely to feed me again soon, shortly, given the time. But on the contrary, I'd like consumers to recognize why it is that it is hard to see the regulator as your knight in shining armor. At the heart of the regulator's agenda of objectives and goals is the protection of the consumer. This lofty and noble ideal is achieved through a mixture of decisions, determination, notices, tariffs, etc. However, the regulator must also ensure that utility companies have an opportunity to make a reasonable return on their investment. Business persons are rational individuals who must make strategic decisions to earn rewards for their investors. Now, oftentimes we as consumers want the regulator to replace management's strategic decisions with regulatory oversight. And sometimes the regulator succumbs to this. And this is often referred to as regulatory capture, either by way of the regulated entity, the political process, or the consumers. It is also possible for the regulator, as I said, to succumb to the wants of the utility customers, the utility company or the utility customers. Now, we would like the regulator to direct opening hours, where the company should have branches, how many days a week the office should open, where there should be electricity, and where water should be trucked to. That's what a lot of times basically consumers want the regulator to do. Regulation is an awesome responsibility with awesome powers. And as David Packard from Hewlett and Packard said about marketing being too important to be left to the marketing department, regulation is just too important to be left to the regulators. Therefore, consumers must ensure that they are intimately familiar with all aspects of regulation, not just quality of service standards and tariff applications. It is also incumbent on the regulator to manage expectations. In a tariff review, for example, and here I am mindful that NWC is obliged to submit to a review process next year, consumers tend to focus on billing problems and/or errors. Very rarely does a regulator get any submission on the method being used to review the utility company's tariff structure or the elements that should be taken into consideration at a tariff review. I've never seen any discourse on what are the attributes that consumers would like to see in a regulator, or more accurately, the head of a regulatory agency. Bearing in mind that there's a marked democratic deficit in regulatory authority, one would want to imagine that the consumers should have a more keen interest in what happens at the regulatory authority. Regulatory authorities, like any other government agency, are susceptible to bureaucracy and monopolistic traits. And when consumers do not exercise their rights to be involved in the regulatory process, they aid and abet the promulgation of arrogance, because regulators will then substitute their judgment. Albeit it is not always clear-cut what is in the best interest of consumers. For example, some years ago there was a decision to be made on whether one should be required for dialing across local networks. OUR felt it was anti-competitive. But many consumers felt that with the differential rates for calling different networks, they wanted to know when they were calling off their own network. So the 1+ dialing, had a lot of persons were looking at it from different perspectives. The regulator felt that requiring the 1+ dialing placed some telecommunications operators at a disadvantage. But what of the consumers? They would have to learn by painful experience, maybe. The Consumer Affairs Commission had varying positions on the matter. Their latest and last position being arrived at after a little more diligent research, I presume. Now, the budget and corporate plan of regulators should also be of concern to consumers. Ultimately, they fund both, and while one tends to reflect the cost of attracting and retaining staff and the training needs of the professional and technical staff to a large extent, the other gives a commitment of what will be delivered. Consumers should therefore be very concerned with what they can expect to get from their regulator. They should have a keen interest in the budget that the regulator prepares and the corporate plan that is predicated on that budget. One of my closest friends, who just happens to be a regulator, once said, maybe the spend on consumer-related issues, or what he termed at the time the softer side of regulation, should be commensurate with the spend on the so-called professional technical side of the operations. J. Paul Morgan's statement came against the background of budgets being crafted with requirements for technical consultants, training for professional and technical staff across the globe, and widely disparate salaries between those charged with addressing consumer concerns and those, and I say this rather loosely, charged with addressing the issues raised by the regulated entities. Now, consumers must decide what they want from a regulator, bearing in mind that this position is not one that advocates for consumers, but instead strikes a balance between the interests of government, consumers, and utility companies. In deciding what they want, though, it is critical to understand the role of the regulator and why, for instance, if it is to discharge its duties responsibly, it must seek to attract the best and the brightest in areas such as economics and law. Make no mistake, the utility companies expend millions of dollars on all aspects of its regulatory interface, ensuring that regulatory decisions, whether on tariffs or operational and competitive issues, are in their best interest. Parochially, no dibby-dibby economist or lawyer is going to secure any victory for consumers. And OUR has an impressive record of winning at the appeals tribunals and in our highest courts, due in no small part to the work done by their regulatory analysts, economists, and lawyers. Not to be outdone, the Consumer Affairs section of the OUR, albeit with much less resources available to it and lower salaries, has gone up against utilities on behalf of consumers and secured improved billing practices and quality of service standards and secured millions of dollars in credit. OUR can be proud of the guaranteed standards it has enforced for utility customers. But despite sustained public education activities, claims remain low. Yet one survey found that consumers preferred to claim rather than have the payment for breaches done automatically. As a consumer and former regulator, I'm concerned that consumers as a whole do not take any interest in the license under which utility companies operate or the regulatory decisions made. And I make this statement despite recent court activities regarding the license of utility companies. Do consumers demand a code of ethics for regulators? Are consumers concerned with how regulators interface with utility companies? In North America, for instance, there are stringent rules regarding how utility company personnel and their representatives can interact with the regulator once a tariff application is before the regulatory authority. One such rule is the no ex parte meetings communication between the utility company and the regulators. In other words, the utility company cannot meet with the regulators without consumer representation. This does not obtain in Jamaica. Consumers should acquaint themselves with best practices and advocate for what they would like to see. And here I'm not saying whether what obtains in some jurisdictions in North America is better than what obtains in Jamaica. I'm just saying that research needs to be done. Consumers should be concerned with who is eligible to hold the position of Director General and how that individual is appointed. Consumers should be concerned with the communication plan of the regulator to keep them informed. Consumers should be concerned about the access they have to the regulator. Consumers should be concerned about the reduced number of public consultations on tariffs, down from 1 in every parish to about 1 per county. Consumers should be concerned about the relationship between regulator and the regulated. Consumers should demand to be consulted on the work plan or corporate plan of the regulator and hold members of the office accountable to carrying out the promised activities. Consumers should be concerned about what takes place in meetings of the office and who is eligible to attend these meetings. Essentially, consumers should be concerned about every aspect of the business of regulation, bar none. The fact that OUR has rendered 15 years of excellent service to Jamaica is not an excuse for consumers to sit back and become complacent that decisions are made in their best interest. The best way to determine what is best interest is to consult and receive feedback from the consumers. Failing that, our regulators will become more arrogant and perceive themselves to be omniscient and all-powerful. In some jurisdictions, utility regulators are mandated to pay for the expert advice consumer organizations require in order to contribute to the tariff review process and the decision-making process of the regulators. For the next 15 years, consumers, my charge to you is to research the role of regulators and advocate for the type of regulation that you would like. Thank you.
Morning, colleagues. Okay, difficult wiki to follow there. So I'm going to talk a little this morning about the regulatory issues from the perspective of micro, small, and medium-sized businesses. And I would want to say that the experience, the practical, actual experience of MSMEs with regulators have contributed to much of the negative perceptions that we've heard David talk about. And I want to summarize them just in 3 ways. One, that regulators limit and constrain the progress of small businesses. Regulators tend to focus on why things cannot be done rather than how to get things done. Regulators tend to make negative assumptions about the MSMEs, the businesses, and justify their limited behavior by these assumptions. And the main assumptions that we tend to hear about is the assumption that the business owner is dishonest. And so all these rules is to deal with this dishonesty. And in so doing, the third perspective that I'll talk about is the lauding of the power, the authority, the arrogance that David mentioned, which in many ways tend to demoralize, be disrespectful, is insensitive and authoritarian. Beyond the words used sometimes in communication, the very facial expressions and body language, there's a kind of look of a regulator, you know? That kind of look. And when you see that look, you kind of know what to expect. And there are numbers of examples that I could spend time talking about, but I'm going to mention a few. And I'm not going to talk about some regulators like the Broadcasting Commission, because I don't have a lot of complaints from some of these regulators. And there's at least one I won't talk about because I think it might be politically incorrect for me to stand here and talk about the experience of the MSMEs with the OUR, especially since the OUR has done such a fabulous job putting this conference together. But I will say something about the Transport Authority and the taxi drivers. They are typically viewed by the Transport Authority as hustlers and tax dodgers. They provide no training and capacity building to facilitate the development of these taxi drivers, and any study will tell you that on average their levels of education and capacities they bring to their trade, many who can't find a job in the marketplace ends up there, and so they need help. And when I talk to the leadership, they'll tell you that they need help and they're willing for it, but that's not even offered. They cannot get a fare increase in spite of the fact that gas prices are rising on a continuous basis. This contributes about 80% of the cost of operation. They are the only private sector organization in the country that cannot pass on these price increases in the context of price ceilings on the part of government. So they have to absorb these costs. And there's no representation of the taxi industry on the board of the Transport Authority, despite numerous requests for such representation. That's one group. I want to say quickly something about the market vendors and the parish councils and people who regulate the markets. They tend to be treated like criminals rather than business owners. And when there are breaches, you tend to see seizures and destruction of their goods. In fact, recently I've heard about rent not being paid, locks being put on the market, the kiosks where they're being sold. And the question they ask is, well, how can I pay you the rent? if I can't get an opportunity to sell. And recently, in the face of Sandy, I was troubled to hear that this practice continued in spite of the knowledge that it is difficult times. People are trying to pick up the pieces in their lives. We have, you know, kind of bend the rules, let me say that, not enforced during the Christmas period. This is a time leading to the Christmas period when I think perhaps we could do a little better in facilitating some of this vending to avoid the kind of bottleneck that is likely to be created if we don't find a way for people to earn a living. And then lastly, I will talk about the small contractors facing problems with the NCC. So bear with me a little, because I think that story is important, and I'll try to do it very quickly. Small contractors have been facing a number of difficulties in the registration and re-registration process. In 2009, April 2009, the OCG and the NCC found there was corruption in the process, and so a fraud squad was called in. And by September 2010, there was a 100% zero tolerance compliant audit imposed by the Contractor General for all applications for registration and re-registration of all grade 1 to grade 4 works contractors submitted to the NCC. There are a number of problems with the NCC registration and re-registration process. I don't have time to go into that, but the effect of this action was to have caused delays and backlogs in applications. And the Contractor General requested additional staff to address the delays, and this was not forthcoming. Let me say that I do support the effort to clean up corruption, and if that's one way, there was no problem. The question is how it's executed and what is the impact and how is that managed. It went to the highest level in November 17, 2010, when Bruce Golden intervened and convened a meeting with the NCC chair and the key persons involved, including President of the IMAJ, a member of the MSME Alliance. And the view was that amnesty should be put in place. The Contractor General's report of 2010 describes this as a moratorium to enable government work contractors whose registration certificates had expired to be deemed to be registered in their pre-existing categories and grades through to February 28, 2011 of that year. So it was just an extension of the process, time, so as to give room to sort out the problems. Long and short of it is that that was deemed to be unlawful. 1 week later, JIS released a statement from the post-cabinet press briefing by the Minister of Information stating, quote, except for contractors whose registration had expired and whose applications were the subject of reports to the police for investigation of fraud, the eligible period for the award of contracts for Jamaican contractors registered with the NCC had been extended to February 2011. That was stated. In fact, the next day, a letter, again in the Contractor General's report, said that Cabinet agreed to a number of policy considerations that should be placed in front of the NCC in relation to the statutory responsibility of registration and the classification of contractors. So something is happening at the highest level. In reality, in practice, nothing happened. There was no moratorium, and the NCC did very little, if any, to our best of our understanding with respect to those recommendations, and the problem persisted. In spite of efforts on the part of the MSME Alliance, Jamaica Wood Products and Furniture Association, the IMAJ, to resolve this matter, it was only until this year, in fact, we got some help from the Office of the Prime Minister, from Mrs. Sinclair McCullough, to look into this matter. September the 5th, we had a meeting with the NCC board and representatives of the MSME Alliance, IMAJ, and the Construction Industry Council. They proposed 3 courses of actions: reviewing the registration process, the procurement process, separation of NCC and OCC. None of those addressed a very simple problem of a backlog that was creating significant hardships for people who were waiting up to 2 years, 3 years in some instances, for their registration application to be addressed. We got finally, in our actions, we decided we'd send a joint letter to the NCC, a 4-page document laying out the core issues with recommendations. But those recommendations relied on the fact that the NCC and the Ministry of Finance has powers under the Contractor General Act that they could have used to resolve this problem. Section 23D, subsection 2, the NCC may do anything or enter into any transaction which it considers necessary or desirable for the proper performance of its functions. We think those are huge powers to have resolved this matter. Section 31, the minister may make any regulation to provide for any matter in respect of which it may be necessary or desirable to make regulations for the better carrying into effect of the provisions of the Act. The core recommendation, and there were numbers, there were about 20 other recommendations. Core one was immediately use these powers to provide immediate relief for contractors waiting for their completion of their registration and re-registration process beyond the documented period of 6 to 8 weeks. That's what is on the website, and that's the time frame allowed. People were waiting up to 3 years. And in response to those efforts, finally, on September the 21st, we got a detailed response to that 4-page document from the NCC, agreeing with at least 2 of the arguments made. Most of the matters were referred to the Minister of Finance, but importantly, a media release from the OCG on behalf of the NCC entitled NCC Contractor Registration Public Notice said that the NCC wishes to advise that effective October 1, the period of registration of contractors is increased from 6 months to 18 months. So I've gone through that long story to say a simple decision that could have eased the pressure and made a difference in the lives of hundreds of contractors. 81 of them have been denied for a number of reasons, and that's one issue. But there are many more who didn't even bother to apply because of they know of this problem. This problem took 2 years, and it was after this kind of effective lobbying where we all made up our mind that we're going to do something about this, to do the kind of vigilance that David said that consumers need to do. It was addressed, and it in fact took only about 9 days from the submission of the recommendations to the actions. There are a number of other issues, but I want to conclude. For regulators to become a catalyst for sustainable development, which is the theme of this seminar, I think they must become facilitators and not limitators or inhibitors of progress of businesses, especially MSMEs, who are supposed to be the engine of growth. They must actively seek to understand the realities of these businesses rather than make assumptions based on distrust and based on negative social stereotypes of who these businesses are. And most importantly, they must embrace, I think, participatory governance instead of the kind of authoritarian governance that we tend to see. And I think it is that framework that will solicit and encourage the kinds of active monitoring and engagement of consumers that is necessary for a more mutually beneficial relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hamilton, Mr. Geddes, Mr. Fuller, Ms. Chung. Seems to me that there's some amount of information sharing that needs to be done or that could be done, more participation in decision making and in the work that the regulators are doing in order to facilitate a more well-functioning market. And the examples that Professor Hamilton has outlined seems to provide examples of how the actions of regulators or the inaction of them has limited the growth of small business and by extension of our economy. Consumers always have this voice, but are we being heard? Are we being heard in a way that can make the systems better? Sometimes we will create systems with a view to making things better for a particular set of persons, and down the road, the persons that we're wanting to benefit are crying out and says, I'm worse off. Is this what is happening? And we need to look at those. I invite comments from the group, from the audience here to participate. If anyone has any comments or anything to add, anything to challenge any of the panelists, questions to pose, I invite you to come forward to the microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me congratulate the presenters on the presentation this morning. David, while you were speaking, something occurred to me. I said, I wonder if David went back to regulation, if he'd be a better regulator or he'd be less arrogant. You don't have to answer that one. But what I wanted to ask was, you said something about a survey that was done which showed that consumers prefer to claim than to receive automatic compensation. In our case in Trinidad, when we reviewed the standards, we found that people were not making claims, and therefore we decided to go to automatic compensation. So I wanted to know what was the reason suggested by the people in the survey for preferring to make a claim than to get an automatic compensation. That's one thing. And the other thing is, in relation to all of the things that you said customers or consumers should do, I wonder if you could tell me how it is that when the regulator makes all of these opportunities open for people to consult with them, they hardly ever turn up. And then we make this claim that we should do more. So how are we going to get them to participate in all of these things that we try to get them to participate when they seem to be disinterested?
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, again. Let me start with the last one. It is irrelevant as to whether they attend, from the regulator's perspective of the obligation to hold that consultation. It is irrelevant whether the consumer attends or not. From that perspective, the regulator must provide the opportunity for the consumer to have a reasonable opportunity, really, of attending that consultation. Now, if 5 persons come, 10 persons come, 100 persons come, that's another issue. But they shouldn't use the fact that persons don't come to say they're not going to have, or they're going to reduce the number of consultations. That's one. I think that they need to look at how they get persons to come out, the methods that's used. A lot of times you may put an ad in the newspaper and that's it. I think a more direct approach is needed. As to the first, what was the first one again? The survey, right. We inferred, when I say we at the time, I was at the OUR, inferred from it that the persons didn't trust the utility companies to really make all the payments that they were going to make. But that was just, what we concluded. It didn't, the survey itself didn't ask, why would you prefer it not to be automatic, or why would you prefer to claim? But at the time that the survey was done, we also know that there was a very minuscule level of awareness about the guaranteed standards. That also has to be taken into consideration. It may have been, if it was 10%, it was high in terms of the awareness of the guaranteed standards. Remember also at the time, awareness of the OUR, when that survey was done, was particularly low also. It was, I think, somewhere in the region of about 40%. When I left, I think it was somewhere in the region of about 80-something%. So there are things, and I don't know that another survey has been done recently about whether consumers want it to be automatic or not. But what I would point out, though, is that if memory serves me well, there is a requirement on OUR to make them automatic under the JPS license. It's not whether they should or they should not. I think the license specifically says that they are at a certain point in time, they must be made automatic. However, for one reason or another, neither JPS nor OUR are seeing it fit to move to that automatic arrangement, and some of the, well, I don't want to speak for the regulator, but I do know that some of the arguments that have been put forward is that there must be a responsibility on the part of the consumer. Fine, but there's also a responsibility inherent in the license, for JPS at least.
Thank you for that. Any other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Good morning.
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 First, to Mr. Miller, as the Fair Trading Commission, do you think it's one of your roles should be to see that there is fairness between the regulators and the consumers? Because one person who can make everything unfair is a regulator. You mentioned about smart regulation, implying that we should have smart regulators. That their interpretation, their position on various matters can make the whole environment be unfair. In any one of the aspects that we talk about. We could talk about the contractor general. If he take a particular position, he could reduce unfair competition within the market. Because you'd have less contractors being available to compete, so the whole competition process would be done. If it is between JPS and the customer, the position, JPS and the customer with the regulator taking a particular position, they can make it unfair for the customer, even unfair for the JPS, if we want to put it in that respect. So that is a question for you. The next matter for OUR, well, not to Mr. Geddes, because he's no longer at the OUR. But the matter came up about the guarantee standard. And they have put it out in the paper for a guarantee standard and persons to submit in writing ideas and suggestions about guarantee standard. I must say for myself, I did submit something without a reply, acknowledging that you sent something. The process of examining those submissions, well, I'm not aware for any question or any query based on my submission. So that could be something whosoever responsible, I think, can consider. And one of the rules, finally, in terms of regulation, would be a principle that particularly the monopolies, they should not be able to do something that they couldn't do in a free, competitive environment. Right? That could be a standard. Example, the OUR, JPS, and even National Water Commission will tell you, if your bill is outstanding for 1 day for $1, you can be disconnected. And they will repeat it to you. People have to be lining up inside the offices to try and make some arrangement to say, boy, something will be there. Now, in the case of JPS, they have a loan because you give them a loan in terms of your deposit, and they give you an interest on it. Right? At the end of the year, it amounts to something. But if you owe JPS 1 month's rent for 1 month, they will disconnect you and it costs you probably $3,000, whatever the figure is. That have no relationship to the money that they are holding for you. Right? So that will be totally unfair if you holding a $10,000 for me and I only get $100, and I'm holding $10,000 for you and then it's costing me $5,000 or $3,000. That is it. So those are the questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much. With respect to the role of the Fair Trading Commission, I will comment on that. we are set up to examine and to monitor the behavior of markets and the behavior of market players in a particular relevant market at a particular point in time. Now, there are other regulators who are set up for different reasons and different purposes, for like the OUR and the Office of the Contractor General, as you said. A part of our function is to work together with these bodies to ensure that the rules of, if you want to call it fair play, are observed in accordance with the Fair Competition Act, which we enforce. And that behavior must fall within the legislation for us to be able to speak on that basis. So from time to time, you may have activity that is being carried out by one of the regulators, which may seem unfair to the consumer, whomever, but which does not squarely fall within the legislation. And there is an advocacy process that we have to go through to talk it out, to talk it through, and to talk through the possible solutions, because not everything that we may say, according to our law, may be in line with what that other regulator was set up to do. So not because it doesn't seem fair means that it falls within the law. The other two questions which you pose regarding the OUR's functions, I hear your suggestions regarding some kind of working with the consumers to address some of their problems. And you said you hadn't heard from the OUR when you submitted your comments.
At some point, all of them must be reconciled.
Yeah.
So part of the market, as you mentioned, is the regulator. They are part and a big part of the market.
True.
Because they are like the umpire. If you have a stupid umpire looking at a match, he can mash up the whole game.
That's exactly right. And that is why I think
You
regulators encourage.
So, but you know, as a man out, you look at the players, you look at the umpire, you look at everybody. And if the game not fair, probably use the person to bring it to everybody's attention.
Yeah, I agree. There has to be discussion and consultation between the different regulators, depending on the situation. And another important part of the system, of how we operate going forward, is that the regulators and the policymakers ought to have regular reviews of what is going on, how the market is changing. The market forces are dynamic. What took place 10 years ago is a different environment we live in nowadays. And sometimes the policies and the legislation that was created at a particular point in time are not changed quickly enough to address some of the issues and new things that come out. And we saw that with telecommunications, with the law being stuck several years behind what the technology allowed for. And that created some amount of distortion in the market and the market players. We heard Professor Hamilton speak about the situation with the Contractor General. They're having their rules and their laws. But the market environment changed. And we ought to respond quicker to these changes so that we can allow people to flourish in their respective business enterprises and what they choose to do. You made mention of the umpire, and the regulators serve as umpires. And if you look in different aspects of our life, like sports, for example, and I draw an example from cricket. Recently, a few years ago, they brought in the technology allowed them to have a third umpire and the big screen, and everybody can see and see the third umpire making decision whether it's correct or not, and the fans feel a lot more comfortable with that decision because they feel that it is transparent, it is open, and in going forward, the game is made better. On the other hand, 2010 World Cup, there's no replay, and we heard the players themselves and the fans crying out about goals that should have been given, which were not. The regulators serve as those umpires and ought to be able to respond to technological advancements and adjust the mechanisms through which they operate and make their decisions. And I think that is what a lot of consumers are saying out there. And they're saying it, but are the regulators listening and making the changes? And we hope that they do. Any other comments or questions? from anybody else? Please, sir.
Yeah, I must commend the presenters for excellent presentation this morning. But there's just one question, and I think Glenn alluded to it when he spoke. We are operating within a particular cultural context, and I don't think Jamaicans tend to be very active in terms of looking after their own interests. Like in my community, the only time a neighborhood watch actually gets off is unless thief broke into a couple cars. And it is a similar context. You will have these consultation meetings, and what you have is a Sunday school class. So my question to the groups, these consumer group, how do you think you should approach and address the whole problem of getting consumers more interested in their affair in a long-term manner rather than in a crisis situation?
You have a comment, Pash?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a lifetime process. It's not. When I face most audiences, I said, ideally, the Consumer Affairs Commission's job is to make itself redundant. It ought to prepare each citizen in this country with all information, the will to advocate on his own behalf. So that once there is a problem with a company, a utility, whatever it is, that person has the knowledge, with the information, has the confidence to go out and get that job done. So you tell somebody they bought the plans, for example, and it has malfunctioned. Their job is not really to come to us as a Consumer Affairs Commission. We are really the last resort person when everything that they have tried doesn't work. They need to take that stand and go with their receipt, go with the evidence, whatever it is that they need to get the redress that they're seeking. In fact, our policy is to make sure that in the long run, that person interfacing with that business person will even want to do business with them again because they are not happy with the way the matter was dealt with. And if you are always doing it for them, you remove that level of interface that is needed to keep people, a balance somewhere along the line. So the education can't be stressed more. It is needed. You have to just find innovative ways to capture the imagination of the public so that they're willing and ready and want to do this. Because unless they feel that they need to do it, then it's not going to work.
David?
Yes, morning again. Cedric, first off, if voter turnout is low, that is not a reason, or the electoral office could not decide that they are going to close down polling stations or whatever. So you provide access to persons in the consultation process. Now, it is their choice whether they participate or not, but you must provide access, and you must do all that you reasonably can to get persons to come. And that includes crafting a sensible and coherent public education strategy to interface with your stakeholders. And that also includes, well, I'm not going to tell you how you would do that. I'm quite sure where you are is aware of another agent is aware how to bring out persons. But what you really have, what you really ought to do, as I said, is to create a strategy to get your stakeholders interested in what it is that you're consulting on. And eventually, you will reach a level where consumers are so active that, I mean, North America, for instance, didn't always have active consumers. They've had it for a long time, but it's not always and not in all areas. So again, it's a part of educating your stakeholders.
I would just add that, just in terms of the broader picture, I think that there is a whole mindset shift that we need to go through as a people. For too long, we've been waiting, sitting back and waiting for government, regulators, and so on to do things for us. I think I have found that citizens respond to a discussion about seeing themselves as owners of the country. That the country is not owned by the people who sit in parliament, all of us. And that comes with ownership. There are responsibilities, there are rights, there are things we need to do, and that the kinds of engagements would include the training at the level of the schools. Civic in schools, for example, is an opportunity for us to begin to plant that seed in the mindsets of our peoples, to recognize that it's really not, if we continue with this kind of hands-off position, then I think we'll continue to see more of the same. And that it is when we decide to change our perspectives of our role in society, the same way we are trained and prepared in our society to get up and get to a point in our lives where we are responsible for our economic well-being. So I think we need to understand that we have to prepare to take responsibility for our social and political well-being. Thanks.
Ms. Chung.
And just to add to what my fellow panelists have all said, I think we need to dispel the notion that we have a public consultation and there are only 2 people there, and so it just didn't make sense. Because we have had in the past the experience where the low consumer turnout, for want of a better term, has resulted in very valuable information and a very valuable contribution to the discussion, especially in terms of tariff reviews, for example, and even on issues. I remember that one on number portability. And when the question was asked, why aren't we having the public consultations as yet? It was almost as if the regulator had decided that they understood what consumers needed to know. And so the importance of seizing the opportunity to have that public consultation at that time was just not there. So I think we need to just stop getting caught up in this thing about numbers and just try to get the contribution from consumers in any and every way that we possibly can.
Thank you, Bharat. My 2 cents worth. A part of our role at the Fair Trading Commission and the Consumer Affairs Commission is public education and building a culture within our society, reaching as many persons as possible. And we have found that the best way to do it is to do it from there in school at younger ages, and go to the schools and teach them and tell them about these things. And as they grow older, they become more aware of certain things and their rights and their consumer issues, so that they can function more on their own in the long run and be more aware. And that's a process that is ongoing and takes a time, a while. David said in the US, they've had it for a long time, but it took a while to get there, and we need to get there. Yes, sir? Morning, sir.
Has struck a chord. I think that it is time that organizations like the OUR, the Consumer Affairs Commission, organizes a think tank. A lot of what is going on today in Jamaica is so outmoded and wrong that we are spending a lot of our resources uselessly. Take, for instance, the matter of distribution of electricity. It's a long story, but in 1962, the urban part of Kingston and St. Andrew were fed by 13.8 kV distribution lines. Mr. Boyer, myself, and Mr. Mannion, we were the frequency conversion engineers, decided that we had to do something about stepping the voltage up to 21 kV. The only way we could do that is to change the delta connection transformers to star. And that is what we did. It took some time after frequency conversion was done for us to get to the point of upgrading to 21 kV. Now, when we came to write JS21, that's the standard electrical regulation, we had to see what we could do about the neutral of the star-connected transformers, because you can't just leave them open and floating around. They could be dangerous. But there was nothing we could do. So we introduced what was known as the MEM, the multiple earthing neutral. That's to keep the transformer stable. Now, there's a problem. Transformers that do not have a delta connection suffer from third harmonic heating. Well, not only the third, but the odd harmonic heating. And so what has happened in recent times is that nonlinear loads are mostly on the secondary side due to computers and things like that. And they feed back a considerable amount of third harmonic feed into the transformers and cause them to overheat. The public service company has taken the view that they will not connect transformers that are delta connected on the primary because it is not standard with what they have. Now, this is rubbish. In America, we have a very efficient system of 208 120 volt transformers, which makes it primary delta and the secondary star. That arrangement has to be done in order to suppress the third harmonic content of the transformer, or the effects of that. Now, the public service company is allowed to say to clients, I recently had a project in which a 750 kVA transformer was ordered by a contractor who was obviously American trained and wanted to put the transformer in, and the public service company wouldn't allow it. Now, I think at some point, whether it's the Consumer Affairs Commission or the Public Service Company, has got to be told what the new technology is, and that somebody enforces that. We tried our best to get the Public Service Company to accept the transformer, and they wouldn't, and it's now cost the client some $7 million to replace it. This, I think, is why we should have a think tank. Call the people who have done actual building of factories, construction of equipment, and so on, to the table to inform the OUR or the Consumer Affairs Commission or whatever, what is modern and what we should be doing, so that we can get rid of old concepts and introduce new ones that make us more efficient and save our resources and use our resources more efficiently.
Point taken. Thank you very much for that intervention. I think we'll have our last question here now.
I kind of figured so.
Close off.
There are about 3 million consumers that I didn't hear you talk about, and that's the members of the Jamaican diaspora. And so the question to you or the panel is, to what extent are the regulators considering that vast market out there, which Jamaica is trying to include in its sustainable development process? That's the first question. The second one has to do with leadership. Who is going to lead this process of dealing with some of the issues you raised? One, the harmonization of the activities of the different regulators to make sure that there is some connectivity between the different regulations. And secondly, getting the laws in tandem with the change in times.
With respect to let me tackle the second and the third, the harmonization of different regulators. There are committees set up that regulators from different aspects are a member of. For example, we have one that the OUR, the Spectrum Management Authority, the FTC, the CAC sits on, that looks at spectrum issues and broadcasting, general broadcasting issues, and how it cuts across the different set of consumers and the different regulators that are involved. So there is that one committee that I am aware of that the Fair Trading Commission is a part of. There are also committees that the FTC and the CAC are a part of with respect to activities from our parent ministry, the Ministry of Industry, Investment and Commerce, that meets on a case-by-case basis to discuss the roads going forward and different market activities. Your first question on the diaspora, I'm not sure how to respond to that because I don't really have a direct answer to that. Does any of our panelists, anybody would like to speak on that? All those 3 million customers out there who want to do business with Jamaica in one way or another, who send remittances or other kinds of support to us here in Jamaica.
Just quickly comment and say, quite frankly, the standards are even higher. I mean, if we're dealing with the people in the diaspora, they're used to a certain kind of relationship with regulators, being sensitive, respectful, all the issues I've been talking about. So I think it just means, the implication is that regulators must lift their game.
Yeah. Thank you very much all for participating this morning in this session, Regulatory Importance to Consumers. We've heard some very informative comments, and I trust that our note takers have made the points, and we will circulate and discuss as appropriate moving forward. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to all.
So how soon you want email? Which
is Dr. Derek McCoy, Dean of the Faculty of Law, University of the West Indies.
Morning, colleagues. My colleague is saying I'm too short. The mic needs to be adjusted. You agree? Okay, welcome all to this our next discussion, our next panel on the role of regulators in policy making. Of course, when this panel was designed, we had certain ambitions. You would have heard by now that we have made some changes, that we have lost our legislators. They will not be with us this morning. We have made a small change, which I'll talk a little bit further. And of course, we still expect Christopher to turn up before the session ends. We think that he has an important voice and something very useful to say. As it now stands, our panel consists of Cornel Green, the Executive Director of the Broadcasting Commission, himself a regulator with many years' experience. Among his misfortune is that he was once my student. But he has managed to overcome that limitation, so I think I'm very proud of him. And of course, he speaks to us from a very useful perspective. If you reflect on it, we're concerned here about policy, and policy is effectively choice. It's decisions we wish to make as a country or as a group or as an organization. It's casting a plan for where we wish to go. It's deciding to accept, to aspire to some things, and indeed to reject others. When we begin this path, however, we'd like to think that our decisions are informed. We'd like to think that when we go about the policy creation process, we're going about it with the best advice we could possibly have. And in a peculiar way, the best advice we can get on the particular subject, whether it be utilities or energy or competition or, you know, the best advice very often is in the regulatory agency itself. So this kind of contradiction, because we're not like to bring together in any place else just that unique collection of skills. It is true, to be sure, they leave and they go someplace else. I mean, we speak of the revolving door. You know, our regulators leaving having acquired the superior training at government expense and the experience in regulation, find themselves out in the industry. And I think we're learning to accept that. But the critical point, they go to industry, but not necessarily all to the same organization. You're likely not to find any better collection of skills in the particular area than in the regulatory body itself. And so I think that the regulator has a very important voice and brings a very unique perspective when we examine this question of his own role in policy making. We have, in this country, begun to accept that there is also an important role for civil society. We are becoming, not only we think, our government is becoming, we think, not only more responsible, but becoming more responsive. We are seeing in this area and in others that civil society and members of civil society and civil society organizations have critically important roles in informing government and informing policy. And we have seen that happen over and over again in other areas. And most recently, I've been looking, almost speaking of the devil almost appears. Welcome, Chris, thank you. In fact, I'm actually talking about you and about your role at this moment. And we've seen, of course, recently in the whistleblower law, you know, that civil society has a critical role to play in determining what that legislation would look like. I'm not happy with it, of course, I concede, but I must confess that what we got depended to some extent on the role organization like Chris's play. Now Chris's organization, of course, is an important one to us. It's been one of our longest run operating private sector organizations. It brings together a wide sector of our community, and it speaks to us, of course, from that important constituency, civil society. And we need to know, of course, what they think and how they believe they can influence the policies that we should aspire to. We have lost, as I said, our legislators. I would have wished, and I'm sure you too, to have heard what they would like to say on the legislators' interpretation and view of the regulator. We perhaps will have to make do without them. But certainly we have a wonderful substitute. You already know, I believe, Mark Jameson, the Director of Public Utilities Research Center and Telecommunication Studies at the University of Florida. I've been wandering through the room this morning and see all of Mark's evidence scattered on all your chairs. So I'm quite sure that you're familiar with him. But he will, I think, speak to us from perhaps from the perspective of the generalist, the one who will give us a wrap-up, the overview as to how we should view this subject. So I'll ask our panelists to respond in this order. I wish to start, if I may, with Cordell Green, the Executive Director of the Broadcasting Commission. After he has spoken, I'll invite Christopher Zacher, the President of the Private Sector Organization, to speak from his perspective. And finally, I'll ask Mark to, in a sense, give us a capsule discussion. And then, of course, I'll open the floor to you. Thank you very much. Cordell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. There are two fundamental points to be made about this topic. Of course, I don't know what those 2 points are. I just wanted to say that because it sounds very profound. I did an audience scan. I saw Pat Sinclair, Professor Layla, Professor Ying. The moderator is the Dean of the Faculty of Law. He taught me law and legal systems, and I said, say something profound at the beginning. That might just take you through. Okay. Now, the point of departure for the regulator must always be the source of its authority, which is statute. So let us begin there. Section 16 of the Broadcasting and Radio Rediffusion Act mandates the Broadcasting Commission to, inter alia, advise the minister on any matter within its knowledge or on which the minister may seek its advice. A similar function is prescribed in Section 4.1d of the Office of Utilities Regulation Act. But the OUR Act also provides for wide discretionary powers to be exercised by the OUR. For example, Section 4.3 empowers the OUR to undertake such measures as it considers necessary or desirable to encourage competition, protect the interest of consumers, encourage the development and use of indigenous resources, and promote and encourage modernization. We see, therefore, that the regulator can perform two roles in policy formulation. It actually makes what can be conveniently termed as micro policy when it is discharging the discretionary powers that have been delegated to it under the Act. The regulator also performs the role of policy advisor to the macro policy maker, who is the minister and, by extension, the cabinet. Now, the provision for the regulator to provide policy advice makes sense because regulators are expected to be experts and can offer technical advice on policy matters, which is entirely different from effecting policy through the application of laws and rules. Having said that, I agree with Ashley Brown, Executive Director of the Harvard Electricity Policy Group, that the boundaries between policy making and regulating are inherently fluid and uncertain. Moreover, the very notion of distinguishing between policy making and regulating may well pose a false dichotomy. Both policymakers and regulators make policy. The distinction is that policymakers define the fundamentals and define the parameters within which policymaking is delegated to regulators. So what then about the risks of conflicts of interest, particularly in the provision of policy advice by the regulator to a minister? Well, the regulator's dilemma is no different than that of a judge who has a symbiotic relationship with lawyers, is guided by them, but must remain impartial and not descend into the arena. Or the lawyer who sometimes is in this schizophrenic situation of being, on the one hand, an officer of the court, whilst on the other acts on the instructions of his client. The risks involved when the regulator does policy formulation are no higher or different than the risks inherent in the principle of co-regulation, where the regulated and the regulator share the responsibility for regulating. So you see, in my view, it is the management and conduct of relations which is key. Regulatory conduct has to be based on principles of objectivity, fairness, integrity, avoidance of conflict of interest, awareness of confluence of influence, and the avoidance of capture. The regulator must be able to give policy advice and see that as completely different from giving effect to policy outcomes, because a policy outcome can be totally different from the policy advice. So the regulator should therefore not be wedded to its policy advice and policy position. It should only be wedded to policy outcomes, law, regulations, and cabinet decisions. There's good reason for this. The regulator serves the public interest, and it is the same principle which should guide macro policymakers. But public interest considerations do not take place in the same context for macro policymakers and regulators. For a macro policymaker, the context is political. For the regulator, the context is usually technical. Now, this is not to say that the political and technical policy contexts are mutually exclusive, but they are certainly not synonymous. So, in conclusion, government needs to create macro policies that encourage the types of behavior we want. Regulators should advise on and encourage the creation of such policies and give effect to them by application, clarification, interpretation, and filling in details left unspecified by the macro policymakers, a process which Ashley Brown describes as micro policy making. So the pertinent question has to do with appropriate behavior by the regulator and not so much its role in policy formation. And I submit that if the long-established principles that guide judicial and quasi-judicial authorities are applied, the regulator's participation in the process of policy making will be inherently challenging but entirely appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cordell. Without any further delay, Chris, I'm going to ask you to come, trying to make this as quick and speedy as possible.
Thank you, Derek. Fellow members of the panel, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I see a lot of my old friends from the OUR here, and a number of distinguished academics, engineers, public servants. I pat my colleagues from the PSOJ, so it's really an honor to be here. I don't have anything profound to say at all, not even an opening statement, so Cordell, you have one up on me with that. And the truth is, I'm just going to kind of speak from my personal experience as advisor to the Prime Minister Golding, and as a businessman for too many years to get into the stage where I don't even want to talk about how many years I've been in business, but many, many years. First of all, let me say that I believe we're still not comfortable in our own skin in this country with regulation, and that the politicians and the political directorate, even though they are the ones that have created the regulatory animals, still have not found the peace within themselves with these very regulators that they have created. And I think that might be natural, because as a country, we are a young country, and as a country with regulators, in particular the OER, it isn't that long, really, when you think about it, in the sort of life cycle of maturity of a regulatory framework and a regulatory organization. Some organizations, the broadcasting people, have been around much longer, and I guess they are more mature. But I have sensed over the years, and in my particular experience, that you know, which is the cart and which is the horse? Cabinet, the political directorate, parliament, the regulator. They seem to sometimes get the roles confused, and that is something I've seen. I think when we pass laws that create regulators, we don't do enough background work. And a lot of the times the laws sort of set the high-level framework of why we need a regulator, what the general powers of the regulator are, or what the point of the regulator is, without actually thinking through now the regulations and the actual specific powers that the regulator has. And I know that I've seen this with the OUR in their tremendous battle, which I think they have now won, I hope, over the telecoms industry in terms of having specific powers which have now been granted to them by legislation. I've seen the OUR have to fight in court with the very people that they regulate. And if there were more specific regulations, I think that could avoid a lot of these things. So a lot more, my point is that in my view, a lot more thought has to go into the policy side prior to establishing regulators. And I know there is talk about new regulators being set up, a separate telecoms regulator, a regulator for energy, separate and apart, or in addition to the OUR's powers. It still hasn't been made clear. And really what I would like to see is a lot more thought go into legislation that creates regulators, creates regulation, and a lot more emphasis on providing a regulatory framework in advance of the creation of some of these creatures. A good example, for example, of not moving, putting the cart before the horse, or the opposite, is the creation of the JPS contract when JPS was privatized, which was done prior to the OUR properly being set up and prior to the OUR's involvement and real maturity. And I think that was a mistake, and I hope it's something that we don't repeat over and over again. And it's a good example. And I'm kind of mixing my message, mixing the topic. The topic is what role the regulator has to play in policy. But I think that just speaking as on a practical basis, there are several issues around regulation in this country. That is a case, the JPS license, a case where if the regulator was in place in advance, so that we had contemplated divesting the JPS, making it private, if we had set up the regulator well in advance, formalized the regulations, then a lot of the contractual issues probably would not be of judicial interest at this point. So that is one of my messages. Does the regulator have a role to play in policy? Absolutely, in my view. I understand what Cordell is saying, that really at the end of the day, the regulator must take the laws and regulations that the Parliament, and I guess by extension the people, have given to it. But it is my view that there is a lack of capacity to develop appropriate laws and regulations without the input of, say, the Broadcasting Commission or the OUR. And I think they have a tremendous role to play in advising the politicians as to the direction of policy and also the specific regulations that need to be in place. And I think there should be more formal mechanisms for listening to what these people have to say before certain decisions are taken at Cabinet and certain regulations and laws have been drafted. I don't think we have done enough in that respect. So folks, those are my 2 cents, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Colleagues, I should have mentioned, of course, that Chris also speaks from another important perspective. That as a businessman, he speaks from the perspective of the consumer. And of course, that is a very important part of this discourse. I'd now just like to ask Mark to join us and just give his presentation. And then at the end of that, I'll make 1 or 2 comments and open the floor for more discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you in this program. As Dean McCoy explained, Yesterday we had head minister Pickersgill substitute for the prime minister. So the first team couldn't make it, so the second team filled in. Minister Pickersgill could not make it today. So the OUR contacted the third team. The third team said no. So they contacted the fourth team. The fourth team said no. I won't go on, but just to explain, I feel very proud to be an honorary Jamaican today. And I hope that I can fill the role, at least in some way. The topic we have before us is really, I think, an interesting one and a fascinating one that creates a real dilemma for those involved in regulation. And I'd like to illustrate it with a story. And this is an episode that happened in the past 2 years or so in a small island country. The regulatory agency was fairly new, had only been around for about 3 years. And the Minister for Utilities called the regulator into his office. And the regulator at this time was the person who had set up the regulatory agency. So he had been kind of the father of starting regulation in that country. And the minister looked at him and he said, you know, before you were around, and even today, the utilities always kept the lights on. I can pick up the phone and call them and they'll do whatever I ask them to do. What do I need you for? And I think that moment, that particular question that was asked, really hits the dilemma for the regulator in policy. Because the regulator has both a formal role and an informal role in policy. And how the regulator navigates those waters and defines his or her role determines whether or not we have much success, both in policy and in regulation. And as you can kind of get a sense from that question, why do I need you? This can get to be dangerous work for a regulator. Let me start by describing kind of this formal policy role that the regulator really has. And this goes back to another experience I had about 3 years ago. My research center was invited to go to a country, this is a country in Africa, by the regulator. That we had done a course for the regulator on energy pricing, and the regulator said, you know, we have our very first price review coming up this coming year. It is going to be a very big event for us. And we're concerned that the ministry doesn't really understand what our role is and what our work is. And we want to make sure that that's really clear. So we'd like to have a very high-level workshop. The top people from the ministry, top people from the regulatory agency, top people from the operator, and for 3 days we'll talk about how regulation is supposed to work. I said, sounds great, be glad to do that. So I showed up in the country the day before and had a meeting with the ministry just to kind of get a feel for the landscape, what things were like. And I was very surprised to learn that no one in the ministry had ever talked to anyone in the regulatory agency. They'd never met, they'd never talked. And so it wasn't too surprising that the ministry had little idea of what the regulator did. In fact, that was one of the questions the ministry put to me that day, is what's this regulator for anyway? So our workshop started out pretty interesting because we had to have that conversation with the ministry and the regulator about what are we trying to accomplish here? What are our roles? Because absent knowing what the regulator is for, the ministry simply did the job of regulation, not knowing that that wasn't its job. And that, of course, caused all kinds of trouble for the regulator. And the regulator knew that there was a problem here. And in fact, the ministry knew there was a problem, but they never talked about it directly. The conversations occurred through the operator, and we know how well that would go. And they occurred through different politicians, and we know how well that would go also. So we had this very difficult conversation about what is the ministry trying to accomplish for energy in this case, in this country. You know, what are their aspirations for the role of energy in the economy and how that its system should grow? And what it should be like to live in this country, environmental issues, safety issues, etc. And what should be the role of electricity in building the social fabric of the country. We had to talk about these things because that was the ministry's aspirations. And then, if the regulator is going to play a role in effecting those visions of how we're going to get there, how are we going to ensure that the regulator knew of that vision? And how are we going to ensure that the ministry didn't try to micromanage the regulator, play the role of the regulator? And so we had to have this commitment. Here's our commitment for what we're going to understand, where we're trying to go. Here's our commitment for the ministry staying hands off of the regulator. But if you want somebody to stay hands off of your job as the regulator, you have to have commitments to them about how they're going to know, how the ministry is going to know whether you're succeeding or failing. What kind of conversations do we have to have? When do we have to have those? How often do we have them? Who sets the agenda for those conversations? What kind of information does the regulator pass to the ministry so the ministry can be confident that its vision is being accomplished, or if it's not, why not? Is it a failure of the regulator? Is it an impossible vision? Has the world changed? What's going on? And that took us about a day or so to work through that. But that was a really important conversation. The next conversation, this was fascinating, was between the head of the regulatory agency and the CEO of the utility. Because they had to talk about how they had been kind of messing with each other over the years. The operator going to the ministry and getting its way with the ministry, or going to the regulator and getting its way with the regulator, depending upon what the question was, or going to some other politician. And at the start of that conversation, it was very clear that the head of the regulatory agency and the head of the company thought that they were actually going to take the other to task, that the regulator was going to put that operator in his place, or the operator was going to put that regulator in his place. And they started out with that conversation. That lasted for about 2 hours. They finally got to the point where they started to see that they were both trying to accomplish the same thing. The utility wanted to grow. It wanted to be efficient. It wanted to serve the country well. And that's exactly what the regulator wanted the company to do. So why were they at odds? What they found out was there was another group of politicians who were playing them against each other. Because these politicians were telling the operator, do these things, and that same group of politicians was going to the regulator and say, do something else. And they were being played against each other. So they then had to talk about what's our relationship, and how is the regulator going to be able to do its job, given the authority and the communication that it's set up with the ministry, without micromanaging and running into unnecessary conflicts with the operator. It was a good illustration of how we can set up a formal role for the regulator in doing its job and influencing policy by having that authority relationship, that communication with the ministry. And that's the regulator's formal role in policy, to try and let the ministry, the policymakers know, here's what reality is. Here's what's going on. Here's where I'm doing well, and here's where I'm not doing well, and what it will take for us to succeed. And that's a good formal role for the regulator in policy. But if we want to understand the informal role, we really need to understand what's the job of a politician. So let me ask you a question. How many of you came to this conference today hoping that you would learn something that would cause you to lose your job? Anyone here to lose their jobs? All right, politicians are just like the rest of us. No politician goes to the office every day hoping to do something that causes them to lose the next election. That's not what they intend to do. A successful politician wins the next election. And if we are a regulatory agency involved in policy making, we need to understand don't matter. And I could go down a long list. They all matter. And your success in your informal role as a regulatory agency in influencing the direction of policy will be very dependent upon those relationships and how well they're managed. Because the media needs something from the regulator to do its job. The job of the media is to, if you're a broadcast television, to make sure someone turns on that television to watch you and doesn't want to turn it off. So it has to be exciting. It has to be stimulating. It has to feel urgent. Same thing for the radio. It has to feel urgent so that people listen. Same thing for the newspapers. It has to seem urgent so that people will pick up that newspaper every day and read it. Now, as a regulator, of course, you don't want to be seen making a lot of urgent news. That's not real good for your job, but you have to maintain that relationship with the media. So how do you provide them with what they need, while at the same time getting them to provide you with what you need, which is to not always make the headlines? And so we have to maintain that kind of relationship. And we can think about all these other different relationships that the regulator must maintain in order to be able to do that job well, Because only when the regulator's in a good spot with those relationships can it appropriately manage that relationship with the politician, with the policymaker. Because the policymaker needs things from the regulator, accomplishing the goals that we've set forward and not doing anything to cost the next election. And we, in the regulatory community, also need things from the politician, the authority to do our work, the trust to do our work, the space to do our work. And as we think about the regulator in the middle with all these different relationships, and actually our research center conducts a lot of training programs on regulation, one of which is on leadership in regulation, because it's a unique challenge to be a leader, to practice leadership in a regulatory agency. And one of the things we do is we map those relationships in that workshop. But we also then go to the politician and say, you know, the politician has a map of relationships as well. What are those relationships like? Because everything that we do in regulation affects that politician's relationships too, its support group. And so we need to understand that too. So that tells us then how we can work in that space of being informally influential in policy, because that's already been discussed. The regulator is a product of policy. And if you're a product of policy, it's problematic to try and influence the process that created you. That's not really your role. But you are probably the most technically expert, you have the greatest technical expertise on the issues of anyone else in government, certainly, and maybe within the country. Also, the regulator is the voice of what should be the rule of law, of how do we make substantive decisions, and how do we practice our structure. So I think of it this way. I think of three circles. One circle is this question of what can we really do? And that's why we have engineers, scientists, economists, financial analysts. They tell us what is physically possible to accomplish. And then we also have this circle over here that is about, well, we have human institutions. We have people. What can we really do with the people that we have? And hopefully those circles overlap. But we also have a third circle, which is down here at the bottom, is where I put it, and that is what do we really want? How do we express our values? What are we passionate about? That's the political arena. So we have our human institutions, what's technically feasible, what are we passionate about? Sometimes it's hard to find where those three circles intersect. And that, I think, becomes then the informal role of the regulator. How do we perturb that system? How do we poke that system so that it finds that space? Because the political arena focuses on the values of what we want, some of which isn't possible. The human institutions focus on what do they want to do, some of which we don't want them to do. And then the physical space tells us where we can really go. Because we can have great aspirations and great dreams, but if we can't do it, that doesn't work. And so I think that's part of really the informal role of the regulator in public policy. So let me go back again to where I started. We're in a small island country, and the minister has called the regulator of this fairly new regulatory agency, and he says, you know, the utility always keeps the lights on. I can call the utility, and they'll do what I ask them to do. Why do I need you? And the difficult answer to that question is, Minister, I'm here to keep you from making that phone call. Because in order for the utility to do its job efficiently, it has to answer to a financial bottom line. And if it answers to you instead, that's an unstable investment environment. And that investment doesn't get made and doesn't operate efficiently. So it's my job to tell you, the person who created me, no, you can't do that. In fact, it's also the job of the regulator to tell the consumers, here's some things you can't have, that you want, that you aspire to. And to tell the operator, yeah, we know you'd really like to do this, and maybe you deserve it, but it's just not possible, to tell them no as well. In fact, when I think about the role of the regulator, oftentimes I describe it as the role of disappointing people, maybe everyone, but at a rate at which they can endure. Because if they're practicing leadership and thinking about where we'll go in policy, if we don't allow the system to be perturbed, but at a rate at which it can endure, then we either don't make progress or our system starts falling apart. And I think that's the real challenge for the regulator in working in policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Colleagues, I'm about to open the floor to you, but before I do so, I'd like to claim Chairman's privilege, if I may, to just raise a couple of points I thought emerging from the three previous discussions. I must confess a little shudder went down my spine when Cordell spoke, and I believe the term he used about core regulators. Was that the term he used? Am I correct? When he suggested that there is in fact a sort of a role of core regulation, if I made a note of it. And it bothered me when he said that, because I think one of the things we worry about in the regulatory framework is the threat of clientelism, the threat in which it's very easy for our regulators to begin to operate to prosecute the interests of the utility. Those who are on the side of the utility, very happy to be in the regulatory framework precisely because of that, precisely because, as Mark said, we have this what appears to be a commonality of interest. There's a very great danger, you know, when we don't take that into account, when the relationship, I think, becomes too intimate. And it's something that bothers me personally as a consumer. It bothers me as a teacher because I teach about the threat of this. And I wondered perhaps if you were as disturbed as I was when Cordell, in fact, raised that point. I'm not sure why I'm picking on him. I can't understand.
You want to respond?
No, I'd like to just make the 3 points, and then I'll come. Well, would you like to respond first? Because I have another point to make.
Well, yes,
Sure.
because there may have been a misunderstanding there. No, I wasn't speaking about core regulations, although there must be core regulations.
No,
and
I said that core was the term I thought you used.
core
Yeah.
regulation. Yes. That's a concept. I mean, I wasn't proselytizing the concept. I'm saying it's an inescapable concept. There is a notion that as you move away from a construct that allows for the more traditional approach to regulation, which some people call paternalistic regulation, as you move about in an environment which is being characterized now more by empowerment and with increasingly limited opportunities for traditional regulators to mediate, whether it is in what goes on in the home or in enterprise, the regulatory responsibilities increasingly start to shift, so that there is the notion that personal responsibility, which has always been around, become now a matter of priority, just simply because of the environment in which we operate. So media literacy becomes a central issue, not a regulatory approach that seeks to inoculate, because it just doesn't work in this very porous and digital environment. And industry too must begin to articulate more and embrace concepts of corporate social responsibility, and that there are some matters that regulators really ought not to be intervening upon, that Milton was speaking about this morning, about kind of shifting away from an authoritative governance construct to a more participative construct. But then you don't of course, in any way compromise ultimately your responsibility as a regulator. Because I have the microphone, by the way, I just want to say one last thing, that I am getting increasingly, I'm getting increasingly depressed because the last point that was made by Mark is that the role of the regulator is disappointing people, and I agree with that. But when I align that with the earlier panel, when you had the very gorgeous Rosalia Hamilton saying regulators aren't attractive people, I mean, you know.
we'll come back to that discussion in a few minutes. There's another point, I think, Cordell, which arose from your presentation, to some extent reflected in what Chris said as well. And I think you spoke about what you called micro-policy development and micro-policy application. And the question, of course, is really how independent is that policy development, and what are its real implications? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm hearing the people next door. I have a sense, of course, that when we want something, we don't wish to entertain debate on it, we say, of course, it has to happen. It is something that the economics or policy requires. But there's a sense in which the regulator sees the industry from a different perspective. And I'm thinking, for example, of your industry in particular and what it means. I believe you have a sense that your industry needs to modernize and needs to change. If I've read your policy statements correctly in the past, there's a sense in which we're moving into a new digital age. And the old method of broadcast and the old method of delivering content will not be appropriate. No doubt, of course, the new digital age may make it easy for you to manage and regulate it. But also it has certain significant economic implications. For example, the cost of transition from the current system to a new digital system. And I wondered, in fact, how much of that is driven by policy, and how much of that policy considers the sort of burden that will be placed on the participants in the field. I'm not sure if you want me to leave that for the audience to ask you, or you want to respond to that now.
Well, probably we could just get it out of the way by saying that a regulatory principle I didn't allude to in the presentation is that of being evidence-based. Increasingly, you can't regulate, or you're not going to be a good regulator flying by the seat of your pants. Regulation has to be grounded in hard research, and a part of that is regulatory impact assessment, which is really what you're speaking about. So yes, if you think about digital television switchover, we accepted from as far back as 2003 that we need to modernize the television transmission systems in Jamaica, but we didn't make a quantum leap and mandate it. We began through a process of education and engagement. We engaged locally, regionally. In 2008, we ensured that we created a national digital switchover policy discussion paper for Jamaica. We established a national steering committee in February, chaired by the minister with co-chairs from the regulator and industry. And we just completed in July of this year a feasibility study on digital television switchover, because it's important when you make your final decision on transmission standards and also on the date for digital switchover. You don't set a date or choose a standard that then would be counterproductive. You do, however, have a point in saying that as the regulator thinks about change, and the regulator thinks about capture, the capture is not only external, and the most insidious form of capture is self-capture. So the regulator really can't be arrogant in how it contemplates regulation. And so I go back to what Rosalie Hamilton said this morning, which I embrace entirely. A participatory governance approach is required, particularly in these dynamic and changing times when the regulator doesn't always have the answer and increasingly is having to regulate looking around the corner.
Thanks. Colleagues, before I turn it over to you and to invite you to respond to what was said earlier, there's one other final point I thought I would comment on, because I was provoked by it, and it's what marks the source discussion as to the relationship between the regulator and the political directorate. Some of you probably know that I had a small excursion to public service. And when I went, I was driven by the thought that politicians should be kept out of the decision-making process. And I'm now reconstructed. I think, in fact, it's a horrible point of view. But I have this fear that public servants, you know, really believe that the public service is for them to manage, and that our politicians are just getting in the way, that they don't have the skill and capacity. And there's a sense in which we tend to depreciate, and I think it was implicit with respect to what Mark said, we tend to depreciate the role of the politician, that person speaks from the perspective of perhaps the most important constituency. He speaks from the perspective from the constituency of the electorate, of the consumer. Someone who sits in an air-conditioned office in New Kingston, regulating industry, is really far removed, you know, from what happens in the real world. Someone whose job depends on what people in the street think, perhaps is far more sensitive to what ought to be accomplished. And I thought perhaps that is worthy of more discussion. So colleagues, I'm going to ask you to bring forward your questions. I think, is there a microphone on the floor? Right, okay, so if you just step up to the microphone and ask a question, I'll try to manage as best I can. We have about half an hour to get through this stage. I'd like to think that you're also persuaded by what the three speakers say. You have nothing further to ask, but that may not be the case. Very well, please. This is will you just announce yourself, please? I know you very well, but my colleagues may not know you. If you just say who you are and before you begin. Neville Young, former professor of the University of West Indies, and of course of what used to be the Mono School of Business, now the Mono School of Business and Management.
Thank you for the advertisement. I just want to pick up on 2 points, really. They underscore the point about evidence-based research to guide the advisory role of the regulator to the politician, and ask the question whether all the regulators can speak or replicate what you mentioned about the kinds of research that's done in order to inform these decisions, and whether there's a conscious attempt to build this research capacity in the regulators that exist in Jamaica. The second question is about relationships, which was mentioned, which is very, very key. And this morning we heard about the emphasis on economics and law in the regulatory bodies. To what extent is there attention given in the skill set to human resource skills, and in particular leadership skills in the regulatory bodies?
Would you like to respond to that, Koda?
Well, I actually do believe that it is part of the regulatory culture in Jamaica to attempt to be evidence-based. I mean, if you take the OUR as the point of departure, you do hear regularly the OUR engaging in consultancies, and sometimes people frown when they do this. When they say we bring in consultants to look at the situation in a very granular way so that we can take sound positions. Many people think that that's a waste of money, but it's important. So I know the OUR does that. I know the Broadcasting Commission takes that approach. I mentioned one piece of research. We have about 4 others. There's one that's just coming out, collaborating with Carimac, looking at media output in the Jamaican electronic media sector. And we just completed our own internal research and analysis of the viability of the commercial sector in Jamaica. Your question, though, I think pointed me in the direction of collaboration between regulators and shared services in this very important undertaking. I think that is where there's a gap. We do operate as regulators in a kind of in silos. Now silos have become a bad word recently. I actually don't subscribe to that view. I should mention that at the nascent stage, there is this thing about trying to establish an inter-regulators forum in Jamaica. And one of the purpose of establishing that forum is to address precisely the point that you have raised. What are people doing, and ensure that you, to the extent you can, avoid duplication in the work, the research work that is done. Now, the second question had to do with the first had to do with research across in the regulatory environment. What could you remind me about the second one? Oh yes. Well, and I like the way you put it, because your point of departure was, you know, people mentioning law and so on. The Broadcasting Commission is going to its strategic planning retreat on the 8th of November, and I can tell you that coming out of our SWOT analysis and review of the last strategic period, that we are emphasizing not just this business about training and development, but also talent management, making that a priority, because that's a central and very important issue. After all, most of us are knowledge-driven organizations, and I think there is insufficient attention paid to that aspect of the budget. Again, it's sometimes the hardest thing to defend, because when the mistake might be how it comes up in the bottom line, training and development. You know, you have people who think that going off to conferences and training programs, that it's people going on holidays, and you know, anybody who goes on these things know that is the, I mean, if you really do participate, you come back more tired, you know, than you went. But so people, I think, have to, and it's not just with the regulators, it's across the board. We have to embrace the reality that if you're talking about capacity building, it is a costly undertaking. In much the same way people always talk to regulators about communicating with the public, public information. But when the budget line shows it up as looming very large, people challenge you, because they think this is about writing a press release and occasionally having a meeting. Red Stripe Beer is selling a beer. People are promoting dances. People who create lyrics that don't necessarily serve the purpose of national development, they're in a business and they promote it. And we can't tell them not to promote it, but the regulator can't bring the counter to that by speaking and issuing a press release. The whole point of advertising is to change behavior. So that public information too, along with the area that you have addressed there, must become priorities in this digital age. And it is costly, and industry and the population must accept that and embrace it and encourage it when it looms large in the regulator's budget.
Mark, do you have a response to those questions?
Sure. I think you're exactly right that the technical expertise is paramount within a regulatory agency. In fact, there's a school of thought that thinks about expert agencies like utility regulation, but also healthcare regulation, et cetera, is in a sense a fourth branch of government. And it's a fourth branch in the sense that it has a different relationship to how government operates than any other part of the government, the legislative or the judiciary or the executive branches. And its relationship is with the people in the world who are technical experts. So they have a unique relationship with academia, for example, or with the most sophisticated of consulting firms, because they're their intellectual peers on how do we think analytically and how do we make fact-based decisions. And so that building of that technical expertise is critical in the regulatory agency. If we don't get that work right, we fail. We have to get that done well. With respect to the leadership issues, my sense is that in most places of the world, I couldn't tell you about here in Jamaica or any particular country specifically, but my sense is that it is indeed underinvested in. Because we oftentimes think about that as well, we're managing people, they have formal roles, and how do we get people to do their jobs? But there's also this challenge of how does this agency operate in its political environment? And there's no rule book for that. It's not a matter of getting people to do their jobs, but instead to practice that art, if you will, of having all those informal relationships with people in the context of our formal roles. And then also that ability to perturb the system, and knowing when we're perturbing it too much and when we're perturbing it too little. And that is, I don't like to say things this way, but I'll say it because it's the best fit. It's a much more of an art than a science. It's an issue of professionalism. How can we make those judgments without knowing whether we're doing the right thing or not? And we will never know for sure, but we still have to make good judgments on that. That's how I think about those issues.
Chris, do you have a contribution to the discussion?
Well, what has stimulated me the most in the whole discussion is this concept of the regulator also having to manage its relationships, in particular with the politicians, but clearly with all stakeholders. Kind of drifting away from Prop's point here, but Mark went back to it a while ago, and it's quite fascinating to me. To be honest with you, intuitively I agree with him, but maybe emotionally I would say, if you get too cozy with everybody, how can you be a regulator? So what he really said a while ago is a delicate professional balance, which is an art rather than a technical skill. And I think it's something that from a business point of view, I know business people feel once they encounter the regulator, there's always this sort of very technical, you know, this is the way it is done and so on and so forth. So maybe we're gone a little bit too far towards strict by the book without looking at what is really affecting you the stakeholder. Now, where that balance is a very dangerous road to go down. So it's something I think that could be further explored and further discussed and maybe what Cordell suggested of a sort of interregulatory forum to put these issues on the table and discuss them within the regulatory family, so to speak, maybe the way to go. But it is a very, very interesting topic. Sure. And it's something that as a president of an organization that has to advocate for policy changes, we have to think about all the time. You know, we need an IMF agreement, but that may lose you the election. How do we push for these kinds of things? So,
yeah, thanks. Colleagues, before we go on, if I may just add a small footnote to what Cordell said about skills development. One of the fantasies we had in the public service some years ago was the concept of some internal marketing of technical skills. You know, the recognition was that some departments were pretty much over-endowed, and most of us were under-endowed, and we didn't necessarily get the best allocation. If you could find a scheme whereby we could buy or share the skills that we had, then of course we would have a better allocation using the very limited resources. We haven't done a good job of it. I think the FTC managed to have shared an economist with its mother ministry. But generally, that is clearly not what we're thinking about. We thought a more useful market. But clearly that was then a fantasy. Perhaps it can still be realized in the future, whereby we can go someplace else in the public service and buy the bulk, or quasi public service, and buy from them in part-time, you know, the skills that we probably need only for a very short time. We have someone else by the microphone. Would you please tell me your name, please?
Good afternoon. My name is Melissa Sutherland Campbell.
And you're from?
I'm from Lyme, but I'm making a comment in my own right as a regulatory specialist.
Thank you.
Not as an employee of Lyme.
Sure.
And I have a comment, but before that comment, just to go back to the discussion, which is how can regulators influence both legislation and policy? Unfortunately, we don't have anybody from the government here. That would have been very useful. And does involvement in policy issue compromise the regulators' impartiality, commitment to transparency and independence? Earlier on, we had picked up on Cordell's note on co-regulation, and Mr. Zaka had mentioned what he sees sometimes as this fluidity, for want of a better word, between the regulators and the policymakers, and what could be considered to be role confusion. I look at it as a continuum because it is intended that both the policymakers and the regulators will work together in what is considered a mutually reinforcing process. So they are not at odds with each other, but are actually working together to achieve a common objective. It is agreed that sometimes what that common objective is or will be can itself be contentious. It is also anticipated that the regulator will also play that part in leapfrogging, establishing a future for that industry, that area that is being regulated that is better than the current today. So most legislation, not just in Jamaica, but across the region, actually provides regulators with that opportunity to be in that policy cycle with the policymakers. So it's important for us to see it as...
I take that last point to criticism of the question I asked Cordell about digitalization. Never mind, I'm just teasing you.
Actually, I'm not criticizing at all, but just stating how it is intended for it to be. So it really is that continuum. And it's to me, it can't be that the involvement of the regulator in policy making should ever compromise its impartiality, commitment, or transparency. The fact that you're involved in a process that might have some tension does not mean that your position is necessarily compromised, because there is a rule in that continuum for the regulator. And in fact, because regulators tend to be specialist agencies, they have a particularly important role in coming back into that process to ensure that there's continuous development in that area that is being regulated. So I really want to say that I'm very hopeful that we'll step back from the notion of a tug-of-war, the notion of just tension, even as Minister Powell had mentioned yesterday, that says the fact that you disagree with me is actually a healthy thing. It's not unhealthy. We're trying to achieve an objective, but there's a process to get to that place. Finally, just to come to Mark's point in particular about leadership, a regulatory authority must know what they stand for. Everybody in that authority must understand what their role is. It also takes personal courage and character to do what is necessary and to do what is right. So it is more than just the technical skill sets. It's also a character, it's also building skills into that authority and everybody who works in that authority, that this is what we stand for, this is our position, and it's a position that is defensible because it's built on certain principles. If you have a principles-based approach to what you do, it becomes very difficult to be derailed by other persuasion, but it does take courage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Khalid. So we have another perspective. It seems to me generally complementary to what the panel has said, but of course I'll now throw this open to the panel to respond if anybody wishes to do so. Mr. Abbott, Chris, you have a point of view, Chris?
No, I think her points were very well made, and I think they do echo what I've heard today. This woven into what the lady was saying is this tug of war and this sort of, it seems to me that there was some discussion about a breakdown of relationship between the regulator and the politicians. And I'm concerned that there seems to be this the tug of war may be a little bit too strong sometimes. And I would just urge that that there has to be a way for everybody to understand each other's point of view, which is what Mark said. And I think it's a very critical time right now in terms of energy and electricity. And I'm concerned that there needs to be maybe a middleman or a middle organization that plays a sort of facilitator role to bring everybody together. And I've been trying to see whether the PSOJ can play some sort of, not just the PSOJ, but the private sector broadly could play some sort of role to smooth out and try and have every party see each other's point of view.
Okay. Thanks very much. Would you please tell me your name and your organization?
Yeah, my name is Earl Dawkins, and, well, I'm the caretaker for West Kingston. My perspective on the policies, the regulator is a policymaker. I think that the regulator is a policymaker based on the decisions that they make, just like a court. The court establishes law by the decision that they make. They make the interpretation of what is regulating us. And those are actually more than writing the policy. This is what affects the person on the ground. What decision do you make? Example, a matter with the OUR and JPS, in terms that they have an interpretation that JPS could come in your property without a warrant, based on all that they have read. And you have mentioned things like evidence-based thing. You know, I think that the research was lacking. I think that in coming to the decision, but like a court, you can always go back and look at the decision, that what was the conflict and what was the decision of the court. And we know that precedents can overturn from time to time. So the regulators making a decision, one thing I would want to put on the table is that some of these decisions that the regulators are making must be published from the point of conflict. That means the customer, in the case of customer and the utility, some point of conflict coming, not just going to the regulator and the regulator dismiss you. You have put a point that is in conflict with the regulator. And what they will do if they are on the side of the regulator is dismiss your thing. I don't think the public will be aware of it. To say, well, somebody's challenging the utility. They have come up with a certain point of view, and the regulator came down on the side of the utility based on these facts that were established. Well, I don't think we have that. My perspective on the policies, the regulator is a policymaker. I think that the regulator is a policymaker based on the decisions that they make, just like a court. The court establishes law by the decision that they make. They make the interpretation of what is regulating us. And those are actually more than writing the policy. This is what affects the person on the ground. What decision do you make? Example, a matter with the OUR and JPS, in terms that they have an interpretation that JPS could come in your property without a warrant, based on all that they have read. And you have mentioned things like evidence-based thing. You know, I think that the research was lacking. I think that in coming to the decision, but like a court, you can always go back and look at the decision, that what was the conflict and what was the decision of the court. And we know that precedents can overturn from time to time. So the regulators making a decision, one thing I would want to put on the table is that some of these decisions that the regulators are making must be published from the point of conflict. That means the customer, in the case of customer and the utility, some point of conflict coming, not just going to the regulator and the regulator dismiss you. You have put a point that is in conflict with the regulator. And what they will do if they are on the side of the regulator is dismiss your thing. I don't think the public will be aware of it. To say, well, somebody's challenging the utility. They have come up with a certain point of view, and the regulator came down on the side of the utility based on these facts that were established. Well, I don't think we have that. And I think if we have that as a principle, it would go a far way that people could say, okay, there are certain principles. We know the thinking of the OUR on certain matters, or whichever other regulator. We can know the thinking. And some of these matters might need judicial review, because the public now can see it and say, no, what is this? Wonder if it's a case of the regulator being captured. Right? Because you brought the thing that we must think of, the capture of regulators. And I think the public is not really in a position to capture the regulator. But the utilities and those who they regulate are more in a position because they have the profit. They are draining profit from the system. And that can be used to do anything. So we have to look at it. We have to look at those decisions. I would hope that that would be a policy, that the decision, they are a judge. Right? No matter what the politicians say and lay down, they are the one that will interpret it. So if you write a one, they can interpret it as a two.
Okay.
Well, that is my point.
Okay. I said earlier that there's a point of view that is critically important and must be presented, and I think we've just had that point of view. But I wonder perhaps if we could ask Cordell to respond to that very quickly, and then I'll go on. We don't have a lot of time, Cordell.
Yes, well, I'll make the one profound point, which is that I agree with him with qualification. No, absolutely. Reasons for decision should be published. That is good practice.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I came in late, so I hope I'm not off mark. But this question of the regulator on policy and conflicts with the policymakers is something that my approach to it, my view of it, is really, really quite simple.
And you know, of course, I know who you are, and I think most of us do, but you didn't know.
I'm actually, yeah, Paul Morgan.
Yeah. Paul Morgan, the former Director General of the OUR.
My view on it is that the regulator really cannot ever be in conflict with the government's policy, because that's what his job is to implement the policy. I think the question is, how do you get to the formulation of that policy? And I believe the regulator, because of the way he's seized, has every right and every ability to contribute to the making of that policy as a stakeholder. But once it's policy, and that is what the regulator has to implement. Don't want to talk locally about energy and LNG and this sort of thing, but let me just give an example, for instance, of what we do in the Bahamas. In the telecom sector, the regulator actually writes the policy and hands the policy, drafts the policy rather, and hands it to the government. Now, the government can do what it likes with that policy, right? And eventually something comes out which defines the government's position on a particular issue. And what they're doing there is they're really recognizing that in the particular sector, the regulator is seized with the expertise and so on to do these things. But really the government has no reason or no compunction, if you like, to accept the policy recommendations coming from the regulator. But having been done, I think the regulator has a duty to implement the policy as handed down. So it's very simple in my mind. There's no conflict.
It's not unique to the
Bahamas. There should not be any conflict.
It's not unique to the Bahamas. Not unique to the Bahamas.
Let me not ask the local regulator to respond, but actually they have a point of view, and then I'll come back and give Cordell the last word and point. Mark, please.
There are situations like that, and I know the Bahamas works that way, and there are others as well. Sometimes that mechanism doesn't exist. So, to give you an illustration of another country I was in, we were doing a workshop on telecommunications competition, training the regulatory agency, and a few other countries were there as well, and some people from the ministry. And after I was there and we were on our second or so day into the workshop, I learned what was the real purpose of the workshop. And it was that the ministry was going to make a policy decision on how many licenses were going to be allowed. And the regulator was sending a message to the public and to the minister that if you restrict the number of licenses, here's how I'll regulate the industry. And if you have more licenses, then here's how I'll respond as well. And I thought that was a very effective way of initiating a dialogue without trying to supplant the policy process.
Cordell?
Yes, no, I just wanted to make the point that that is not unique to the Bahamas. It does occur in Jamaica. I mean, I can speak for how broadcasting policy evolves. There is now a new electronic media policy which is being crafted in the Office of the Prime Minister. The point of departure was a study done by the Broadcasting Commission and sending up policy recommendations. I want to say, though, that you know, we have to look at reality. And Mark Jamieson did introduce a question, which if we are concluding, I have to respond to, which is a politician who appoints a regulator and basically says, my charge to you is do nothing that will cost me the next election. And therein lies the problem, because the next election for some politicians is always closer than, I mean, they know something that most of us don't know, which is, we might say every 5 years, but that is not necessarily how you determine when the next election will occur. Now, my position is that I agree that the regulator should do nothing willingly, directly, driven by any particular motive which would cost anybody an election. But if a government's policy position is flatly wrong, the regulator must say so. He has to say so. It might be a question of how he says so, what mechanism he uses. And the mechanism is the very policy advice provisions that are written in the legislation. And also, you should not have a function as important as a regulatory function. I don't like this notion either of regulators serving at the whim of politicians. They can't be egotistical because what they do can cost people an election, but I do believe in some kind of security of tenure provision if the regulator is going to perform in the way we expect regulators to perform. If they serve at the pleasure of a minister, we have a major problem, because you can have a very important regulatory decision to take on the cusp of an election. And the decision, the regulatory decision, which is to be in the public interest, won't necessarily coincide with what is paramount as a political interest. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but I'm saying that's a reality, and it is a legal framework, it seems to me, which has to determine how we will moderate that kind of conflict.
Colleagues, okay. Colleagues, it may be appropriate that on this panel, this discussion of the role of the regulator in policy making, we should end with the functioning employed regulator on the panel. May I take this opportunity on behalf of the organization of the entire forum and the OER to thank our panelists. Of course, to thank most especially Cordell, you know, who continues always to amaze me. I'm still proud of you, and I'm very happy you've survived, notwithstanding my influence on you. To thank Christopher, of course, who is like our lumber. He's with us. He comes and continuously supports all of our functions, and obviously speaks, I think, from a very important constituency, as I said before. Not only that representing consumers in the business community, but also that unique sector which helps us to develop and define our policy, that broad sense of civil society. And of course, Mark, who has stepped in and has done a remarkable job for us. So may I, again, thank also you for having stayed behind to participate. And I think we break now for lunch, and we come back here in this room at 2:30. Thank you very much.
Good job. Thank you.